We're unmuted, so whenever you're ready.
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for coming to this event that we're doing for good reasons and for historically horrible reasons. So we decided to do an event on Armenia, sort of on the day commemorating the Armenian genocide, by talking about different kinds of ethnic nationalisms, different kinds of journeys, different kinds of memories of the past. We are also fortunate to have with us Carel Bertram, who's an emeritus professor at the Department of the Humanities at San Francisco State. She is the author of Imagining the Turkish House, Collective Visions of Home from 2008, and she's going to talk to us about her recent work, which was an ethnography of Armenians traveling back to Turkey. We then posed a question for leading scholars in the fields of Jewish, Greek, Armenian, and Kurdish studies, asking them to engage in with Carel's book as scholars that sometimes work outside of Armenian studies, thinking about the ways in which her own insightful work sheds light on theirs. So after Carel will discuss her book, it will be followed by a thematic conversation by the prominent leading scholars. Dr. Janet Klein from the University of Arkham, who is the author of The Margins of Empire, Kurdish Militias in the Ottoman Tribal Zone, and also a scholar who's done considerable work on Armenian-Kurdish relations. Alda Benjamin from the University of Dayton, whose recent book that came out in Cambridge is Assyrians in modern Iraq, negotiating political and cultural space, and the community that she studies also experienced genocide during the war years, parallel to the ones the Armenians faced. She will be followed by Chaim Noy of Bar-Ilan University, who's a scholar of communication. His recent books include Thank You for Dying for Our Country, Commemorative Texts and Performances in Jerusalem, and Narrative Communities, Voices of Israelis Backpackers. And finally, we'll end with commentary by our own Stefanos Katitsa. Oh, I don't know what's happening today. Tell your family name because I'm not going to do it. The thing in my brain is not working now. Who's the author of 4 books, Islam and Nationalism in Modern Greece, Negotiating Diplomacy in the New Europe, Foreign Policy in Post-Communist Bulgaria, State Nationalisms in the Ottoman Empire, Recent Turkey, Orthodox and Muslims, and Bulgaria and Europe, Shifting Identity. So, Carel, we'll start with you. We'll then move to the other members. Thank you all very much for coming. Congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, if you can't hear me, raise your hand or do something disruptive, and I will start to talk louder. Thank you, Orit, for this kind introduction, but also for being sensitive enough to program this on the commemoration day of the Armenian genocide. So she organized this talk, but also went to the trouble of gathering the discussants, one of whom is actually here in person, and the rest who will be on Zoom. So thank you, Orit. And I also want to thank the center itself, and that means Tom McGuire, who made the idea of the talk into an actual real event. And then I want to thank all of you who took the time to come here to listen, whether you're actually here or people who are on Zoom or on Facebook. It's really nice for me to know that you are there. I'm presenting myself today as an art and architectural historian of the Middle East, who sometime in my graduate studies fell in love with Ottoman Turkish houses. But finding that I wasn't exactly interested in how all the eaves of them looked alike, although actually that is kind of interesting, I found that I was interested in how they became so beloved by citizens of the Republic of Turkey. And that's when I discovered that my real interest was less about the visual and more about the affective, and that means the emotional meanings of places, especially as they are grounded in memory. And so I have become a historian of how memory and place get stuck together. My first book, as Ori mentioned, plots the history not of my own love, but of the emerging Turkish Republic's love affair with Ottoman houses. And these were houses that began to disappear just as the Ottoman Empire was closing and the Turkish Republic was trying to define itself. This book plots how this house was affectively and sometimes strategically sustained in memory as an icon of the lost Ottoman world. But the people who remembered those houses, often the houses of their childhood or of their parents, remembered them while sitting in their new Turkish apartments. A house in the homeland refers to this same period and is also about memory and place, especially houses, but from an entirely different perspective. Many Ottomans who lived in these Ottoman houses were Armenian, and they lost them too, but not to modernity. When they lost their houses, they lost their homeland, and many lost their lives due to the Armenian genocide of approximately 1915 to 1923. And whereas the Ottoman house book recuperates the house as it was imagined discursively, meaning how it was represented in novels and poetry, and even in political polemics, a house in the homeland recuperates the meaning of these houses through the eyes of the children and grandchildren of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, who now live in various diasporas, and how they felt as they went to search for those houses. The travelers called themselves pilgrims, and I call them pilgrims too, for as it became really clear to me as I was traveling with them, that while they seemed to be looking for material remains, they were really in search of spiritual goals. Thanks to the trust and generosity of Armin Aroyan, who led most of these trips, and to the many pilgrims who let me join them, I traveled for over 9 years with over 100 pilgrims in many small groups. I sat with them on their minibuses. I listened to their stories. I witnessed what they did when they were hit by the power of what they found. But I also continued my connection with them, often over several years, leading in fact to irreplaceable and very satisfying friendships. This very deep and longue durée ethnography allowed me to enlarge and contextualize the affective range of their experiences, a range that offered insights about the connection between memory and place, the sacred and the profane, and trauma and healing. Each pilgrimage was organized geographically, but collectively, they covered what had once been the heavily Armenian part of Ottoman Anatolia, as you can see by the darkened areas, in fact, all of the areas on this map. But I use this map, imagined as a landscape of houses, for a through line of my book is that the meaning of homeland to these pilgrims was their ancestral houses. That was their homeland's beating heart. It was a house that held all the emotions held by exiles forced from their homes: warmth, wholeness, fear, trauma, and rage. Today, I will introduce 4 themes of my book as based on pilgrimage experiences. First, the ancestral house and homeland as a deeply sacred and spiritually effervescent space, but also the space of the profane. Next, how this sacred space elicited performance, even the invention of rituals that offered pilgrims a restorative agency. And then how the meaning of homeland radiates from the house, but it's mediated by the pilgrims' connection to their current diasporic homeland, hostland. And finally, a possible reconfiguration as pilgrims meet a mirror cohort, Turkish citizens with Armenian roots. Each of these examples is underlined by the importance of memory, and most importantly, how I conceive of the pilgrims' memory stories as fully autobiographical. For what takes them to their houses is their interactive memories of listening to beloved family, telling them what happened, or even their stories of watching them dance their village dances or hearing their screams in the night. So their memories are always commingled with people and places in the diaspora. Many memory stories are embedded in material objects from their survivor families. Marianne brought a thick folder of objects along with her as she searched for her house, and she did find the house, as you can see it there. It included a picture of her father with his grandparents in Yozgat and a hand-drawn family tree that is rooted and growing in Yozgat. A prized possession was a copy of a painting of the town book. I start my themes now with the pilgrim Carel, who found his father's house in the village of Husinik. I start here because it's a good example of how the sacred and the profane appear. Carel stood in what was once his grandfather's garden, now owned by a non-Armenian stranger, and contemplated it as if it were the Garden of Eden. He touched almost every plant and remembered how his father said that no flowers or fruit in California could match the beauty, the size, or the taste of those grown in Husinik. He had brought a Husinik photo of his father with his family and felt a sense of pride of place, for in it, his father was holding a book. A book, he said, and remembering stories told of an educated family in the before time, the time before their lives were shattered, he called out to no one, or maybe to the spirits of the place, "I'm back." But as he walked, he talked to himself, and after looking around, he stopped, he sighed, and he mused, I wonder if they put his head with his body. I took a deep breath. I am now. Carel's father had told him how in the systemic violence of the genocide, he had watched his father being decapitated and how he saw his own father's head rolling along the ground. Every home or hometown that was visited held profane stories. Here I use profane, not like quotidian or non-sacred, but like profanity, as the sociologist Maurice Halbach understood it. To him, profane sites are inhabited by the enemies of God, which may even be cursed, and where eyes and ears are closed. because it was the place where body and soul had been defiled. And yet, because of the families and the values that they had nurtured, the land had become sacred. Carel had even told his wife, if anything happens to me here, bury me here at home. As a historical and a spiritual landscape, Carel understood his ancestral house as an appropriate place for his spirit to rest for eternity, because it distilled and preserved a connection to his immediate ancestors. My next pilgrim is the Armenian folk singer Hasmik Harutyunyan from Yerevan, who traveled to her ancestral town of Mush, an experience that, for me, extends and clarifies how the ancestral home is defined as the resting place of beloved family spirits. My grandparents were from Mush, she said. I grew up with them. My whole life is about Mush. And at home, we ate traditional food, observed traditional days. Everything was done in the same way that they had done it in Mush. My grandmother and grandfather, they lost their whole family. My grandmother lost her first husband and a child. Hasmik then recalled that while my grandmother was dying, she said to my father, when I die, please take me home to Mush. This meant crossing the uncrossable border between Armenia and Turkey. And so my father said, painfully, I can't do that. There's a border, I can't do that. But my grandmother's response was, what is a border for a dead person? Because a dead person's spirit can fly. So there's no border for that dead person. Every pilgrim was caught in this double reverberation of the sacred and the profane, joy and pain, and had to make a choice how to accommodate them. Often this was done through rituals. And so I turned to Oski, who, having found her ancestral village of Govdun, a village near Sivas, performed a ritual of collecting earth to take home with her. But it's what happened as she did this that opened my eyes to how rituals do their job. 5 years before the genocide, Oski's father had left her mother and their only child to work in Providence, Rhode Island. He had the hope of either returning to Govdun with funds or of bringing his family to the United States. But her father lost contact with his wife in 1915, when she and their daughter and all Govdun Armenians were collected and sent on the death marches to the deserts of Syria. Their small daughter died along the way, but his wife survived, and within a few years, she was reconnected with her husband and brought to the United States, and there they had 3 more children. Oski was one of them. Although she found no trace of her house, and neither were there any Armenians left, Oski did find that the Armenians were still part of village memory. And some older villagers even knew stories of her mother's famous uncle Murad, called Sebastatsi Murad, or Murad of Sivas, the famous Armenian freedom fighter who had also protected local Turks. Her own brother had been named for him. And so, 3/4 of a century after her mother had been expelled from Govdun, Oski stooped down to dig some of the earth. But what I found astonishing was that almost as soon as her scoop entered the soil, Oski stood up, looked to the heavens, and began to talk to her mother. Okay, Ma, you got your dream, she said. Ma, I'm here on your land. I know that you never really ever thought I'd ever come here. You had no idea I'd come here, but here I am. And I'm beginning to be proud, Ma. I wish you could have come back to see it. In the process of digging the earth, Oski had activated its spirits. She had opened a channel to the transcendent, allowing her to speak to her mother, who had passed away long before in Rhode Island. This ritual action has changed the meaning and memory of place. For Govdun now became the place where Oski had talked to her mother's spirit. It also made Oski part of Govdun's history and placed her in the generational chain of memory in a new and profound way. I saw this performative power time and again with other rituals, such as the leaving behind of votives or ex-votives, often tucked into lost houses. Steve and Bob left a photo of their survivor family that had been taken in Pennsylvania in what was a proxy house for them. For just as the sacred is in construct with the profane, the ancestral home for this descendant group is in construct and is constructed through the experiences in their diaspora. In fact, I show how these pilgrimages in Turkey are experienced as an overlay map of the towns and villages in the diaspora, an experience that might be one that is particular to Armenians. This felt double mapping became quite visual to me when Armin Aroyan spoke to the pilgrims on the bus to entertain them. Aroyan, who lives in Troy and Albany in New York? He then would wait for people on the bus to yell the names of people that they knew, and he would sum that up as Antepsis, Armenians from today's Gaziantep. Where did the Tadensis live? Waukegan. Tomarzatsis, Racine. In the United States, the first generation of Pasmashensis in Detroit were such a tightly knit group living in the same neighborhood that when they neared home after riding together on the city bus, the bus driver would call out, "Next stop, Pasmashen." Second and third generation pilgrims might have felt something comfortingly familiar if, on arriving in Pasmashen, Aroyan were to call out, "Next stop, Detroit." Their Armenian memories were in the diaspora, but their pain came because the ground in Turkey that they were entering was seen not only as a place brutally empty of Armenians, but as a place of denial that the genocide had ever happened. Everywhere they saw the erasure of their material past that led to a seemingly inarguable Turkish cognitive dissonance. Look, there never were Armenians, but what happened was their fault. So in this place where there were no Armenians left and had never been there anyway, the pilgrims were often unprepared to find an entire layer of Turkish citizens whose own parents or grandparents had been Armenian. In the totally razed area that had been Muriel's ancestral village of Sak, she met a woman who stopped to talk to her for a few moments. When the woman found out that Muriel was an Armenian, she said, "My mother was Armenian. Her mother had been saved as a child and later married to a Turkish man. I remember only," the woman said, "that she always cried." The woman went on to say, "I too was married to a Turkish man. And as a bride, I did nothing but cry." Shaken by her retreat into memory, she then excused herself. Muriel was shaken too. As a toddler, her mother had been left for dead in a pile of corpses in Sak. But when found alive by a Turkish man, she had been given to a Turkish family to raise. But Muriel's mother's aunt had found her and taken her away. These similar stories with different endings made Muriel feel that this woman was like her mirror and could have been herself. Araxi from Racine met first cousins with a happier or somewhat happier story, as their parents had been taken on the death marches, but had left the children behind with a Turkish family. There they were treated as their own children. The older two had eventually left for Armenian, but the younger one decided to stay, as that was the only family he had ever known, and became the beloved father of what would then be Araxi's first cousins. In fact, just a year before this meeting, in 2004, the entire population of Turkey had a rude awakening when a Kurdish attorney, Fethiye Çetin, published her book, My Grandmother. It hit Turkey's bookstores like a bomb. For Çetin wrote that in a land with no Armenians, her beloved grandmother had hidden an Armenian, hidden Armenian past and had been a child in an Armenian village not far away. Suddenly, as people began to ask questions, grandmothers and grandfathers began to be found all over Turkey, where they had been hiding in plain sight, and often just where they had been left. This is a complicated and changing story. It always presents fraught identity problems, but also opportunities for both Armenians and Turkish citizens too. Certainly, this is yet another way that the past is being brought into the present for the pilgrims who meet them. One thing I would like to leave you with as I end this presentation is that what my sustained observations has most made clear is that these pilgrims, in various ways, were always working to make a choice as an antidote to the internal and external anxieties that they saw and felt all around them while traveling, and as a desperately needed balm for the brutal and traumatic way by which they had lost title to their land. This generation of pilgrims chose to engage with their pasts in ways that allowed them to take control of personal histories that seem to have ended in 1915. Thank you.
Continue now? So Tom, we're continuing.
Yeah, we're just switching to.
Okay. So can he start?
Okay, first of all, let us start by thanking the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the organizers for asking me to read this fascinating book and join this excellent event. And I wish to thank everyone for finding time from your busy schedules to attend this event. When I was first asked to join this panel about 10 days ago or so, and I was provided the book after I agreed to join the panel, I never believed I would be able to read the entire book cover to cover for this event in the middle of the quarter with teaching and other commitments. However, the book is so powerful and beautifully written that I could not resist reading all of it. It was so captivating that I did not mind at all putting aside other work that I had to do, and I read it with great interest and pleasure, and I want to commend the author for writing this fascinating book. The narration in this book can easily resonate with non-Armenians, members of other ethnic and religious groups who fell victims of mass persecution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Balkans, Ottoman Anatolia, and elsewhere. For example, a great number of Assyrians, Greeks, and other Christians experienced mass persecutions in Ottoman Anatolia during and following the First World War. Also, following the 1919-1922 Greco-Turkish War, which led to the Turkish Liberation National Movement and the establishment of the modern Turkish Republic, Greece and Turkey agreed on a forced population exchange, according to which 1.5 million Christian Orthodox from Anatolia and the lands of today's European Turkey were forced to leave Turkey for Greece. Equally, according to this same forced Greco-Turkish population exchange agreement, 500,000 Muslims were forced to leave Greece to Turkey. The children and grandchildren of the exchanged Christian, Orthodox, and Muslim families often become pilgrims and do pilgrimages similar to the ones Carel talked to, similar to those discussed in Carel's book, to their ancestral homelands. Yet, although scholars such as René Hirschon, for example, from Oxford University, who has conducted anthropological research on Greek Orthodox victims of the forced Greco-Turkish population exchange who live in Greece, or Mark Janse at the University of Ghent, who has conducted research on the language of Turkish-speaking Christian Orthodox Cappadocians, victims of the 1923 forced Greco-Turkish population exchange who live in Greece and organize similar regular pilgrimages from Greece to Cappadocia and the region of Central Anatolia, I cannot recall anyone who has done something similar to what Carel is doing in her book, through personal observation and personal and family stories, to write a book which crosses the boundaries of disciplines such as history, oral history, memory studies, diasporic studies, anthropology, ethnography, literary studies, travel writing, and so on. Similar types of pilgrimages are conducted by children and grandchildren of families who fell victims to voluntary and forced population exchange between Greece and Bulgaria, Bulgaria and Serbia, not to mention people with similar faith outside the Balkans, such as pilgrims of Jews to Israel, or pilgrims of children and grandchildren of German families forced out of their ancestral lands in Central Europe during or after the Second World War. In addition, besides Armenians in the United States, similar pilgrims to the Republic of Turkey do children and grandchildren of Armenians lived outside the United States, Europe, Australia, Canada, and Russia. In other words, this book can resonate with US and non-US Armenians, as well as with non-Armenians. The book moves beyond macro history and looks at how a major event, such as the mass persecution of Armenians and other Christians in the Ottoman Empire during and following the First World War, were received by Armenians who left the Ottoman Empire to the United States, what selective memories they preserved and passed to the future generations, children and grandchildren, and how these generations remember and deal with that event. The book deals with the important issue of homeland, which is central to the memory of other diaspora communities or ethnic and religious groups who fell victim of mass persecution, ethnic cleansing, forced and voluntary population exchange. What is homeland? And how is homeland experienced and lived through in diaspora? And how is homeland experienced and a second or third generation Armenian born and raised in California or Rhode Island, who later in life moves to different parts of the United States, does not use the term homeland for the land where she or he was born and raised, the United States, or more specifically California and Rhode Island, but for a remote region which she knows through narrations from his parents and grandparents. How important are ideas like homeland in the everyday community life of Armenian and other diasporic communities? How important is the idea and the way the 1915 events are remembered and lived through for shaping political attitudes and the creation of Armenian, Greek, and other diasporic lobbying groups in the United States and elsewhere? How do these pilgrimages feed back memories, traumatic or pleasant, by strengthening or helping change them? And how the idea of homeland and memories of the 1915 events are taught in Armenian community schools in the United States and elsewhere and help preserve memories to the future generations. In addition to helping perhaps the production of similar groups among other diasporic communities in the United States and elsewhere, and in an era when nationalism, racism, and xenophobia are often on the rise, Carel's book helps us understand the mechanisms through which collective and national memories are shaped, constructed, and preserved. It helps us think of the importance of the family environment on the formation of ideas, such as Homeland, and how historical events are often remembered and preserved. The book helps us understand that the way in which historical events are remembered and preserved vary. In fact, next to the official history, there are various micro-histories, and I would like to stop there and pass the floor to others. And then
Let's go Alda, and Jan, okay?
So Alda, we're moving to you now.
Thank you. First, I just want to start off by saying how grateful I am for Ori to invite me so that I could contribute. Really, I'm honored to share my thoughts on this wonderful book, Carel. So congratulations. I enjoyed it and it was wonderful. As a scholar who is engaged with the study of Assyrians in Iraq and in the diaspora, Carel's book resonated deeply with my work with the communities I study. Her powerful and poignant testimony of Armenians in search of their homeland is masterfully written, piecing together memories of Armenia and giving an important space to the intangible, the oral, what makes a homeland home. The reference to Armenian survivors of genocide and their descendants embarking on these journeys as pilgrims is inventive, appropriate, and a true reflection that takes into account the emotionally soulful and spiritual journeys these Armenians are engaged in when returning home. This semester, I am teaching a course at the University of Dayton on minorities in the modern Middle East, where my students and I are engaged with the theme of minoritization of various Middle Eastern communities, along with their pluralistic engagements in certain spaces and places. A House in the Homeland is an important addition with direct connection to the themes of my students and I study. For instance, when studying Armenians, Arab Jews, Copts, Palestinians, Assyrians, Yazidis, and other communities, we look at how minoritization describes a process, is a process, a historical process that leads to the creation of these minority communities, and how it signifies historical and contemporary practices of discrimination and genocide that marginalizes communities, relegating them to an inferior status within the modern hierarchy of citizenship, but also that pluralism celebrates how these communities enrich the cultures of the region currently or in the past, and how they preserved languages, notions of homeland, historical memories, and literature in the face of state pressures, displacement, genocide, and exile. Within the context of pluralism, within this context, pluralism can be defined as a linguistic, cultural, and ideological integration of various communities within particular spaces. A House in the Homeland, again, showcases in important ways, but also in a stylistically moving manner, how the living memory of the genocide and the trauma that survivors have carried with them comes through clearly, evoking new interpretations that give agency to descendants to recreate their ancestral homeland in various ways, but also in pilgrimages that she describes. For the Assyrians I study, who were victims of genocide in 1915, having lost hundreds of thousands of their communities to killings and many, many others, to displacements as well, along with their ancestral homelands, including villages, towns, monasteries, and homes, followed by the CMES massacre in Iraq by the newly created state and the army, which led in 1933 to further killings and displacement of the community. Their collective memories of the Assyrians and connections to their homes were often preserved through objects they were handed from survivors, such as photos that Carel again describes with clarity, handmade frames, pieces of jewelry, handicrafts, but mostly songs sung by grandmothers. and stories of suffering interlaced with beautiful memories of a home, the taste of atunir bread, which Carel describes, or lachmet tanura, as the Assyrians refer to it in Aramaic. Assyrians, like the Armenians, embark in trips to their homelands today, hoping to create their memories and connect to their ancestral homes in towns and villages in Turkey, Syria, Iran, but also Iraq, and where their erasure continues post-2003 in the post-2003 sectarianized Iraq, and most recently, the destruction brought forth by radical groups such as ISIS. With these ongoing displacements of Assyrians and other minoritized communities, we see the continuing loss of their archives, their places of worship, and the intangible heritage. So the memory of and the trauma of the genocide continues in various forms. A house in the homeland contributes in significant ways to the turn we see in Middle Eastern studies, whereby many of these minoritized communities are now examined as members of states, as exiles, as transnational and regional actors, and most importantly, as active agents shaping their own destinies. Carel's carefully crafted ethnographic study shows how the Armenians she studies in her book, which resonates with other communities and members of minoritized communities, were able to reimagine their collective identities spatially, facilitating transnational exchanges and negotiations between dislocated communities in the Middle East and in the West, curating their social memory through tangible and intangible ways to resist their erasure by disseminating the community's own understanding of its history and in remembering home. Thank you, Carel, for this really wonderful book. And I'm grateful to be able to read it and contribute to it today.
Now to climb Noy.
Yes, hello, and I also want to join some of the earlier comments made about how comprehensive and interdisciplinary the book is, how reading is thought-provoking and beyond thought-provoking, and I think some of the comparisons that already mentioned, or comparisons or analogs with other genocides, denials of genocides, and so on. So I put that aside, and I want to make two comments. The one begins with modernity, and the comment about modernity is really that I think the book captures very well, beginning with I think you mentioned this in the introduction about modernity and genocide and some of the characteristics, the profane characteristics of modernity, specifically, such as modernity in the Holocaust by Zygmunt Bauman, and then also modernity and memory, modernity and denial of memory, sort of the active of vacant memory, of actively trying to erase memory. In an age where memorials and monuments, are so big with national and collective memorialization and commemoration. So what happens where there is the lack thereof? And one of your answers is really that the pilgrims themselves are becoming, kind of animated, embodied, mobile, transient memorials, which I thought is beautiful. I also thought that an important aspect of modernity is travel, and that I hope, and like it cannot be stressed enough. And I think the book is in part about travel, about pilgrimage, about modern tourism, and about the semiotic and material and mobility systems as they come together, as they converge, in what they allow the Armenian diaspora and travelers to do. So this has to do with the bus or the minibus, as you mentioned it, and this has to do with the entire mosaic of these semiotic means from flights to pictures, to maps, looking from the bus outside, looking from outside the bus into the inside, these different types of mobilities, and the way they use them. And specifically, maybe this is a little semiotic here, but specifically I was thinking about some of the symbolic versus indexical mechanisms here, where the indexical means that they're saying I'm here, or they're taking soil from one place to another, or they're showing pictures, old pictures, or taking pictures, versus memories, versus the cover of the book, which I think, if I recall, is not a picture but a drawing. So, and also nicely in your presentation, you showed some, maps that are drawn near pictures that were taken at the spot in situ. So this kind of tension between indexical and symbolic, but also, as I said, more generally, the semiotic resources. And of course, the last thing I'll mention in this regard is the stories, which the role stories play vis-a-vis travel and vis-a-vis memory. The memory stories, as you mentioned them, and how embodied they are, and what they do to the places where they are anchored in, or where they are made to inhabit. I think you use these phrases, sort of the stories inhabit the empty houses or the gone houses, or so it's space and mobility and stories. And the stories is maybe kind of ethical agents of counter narration, where the narration is the deletion or the erasure, and they function to count. So all of this is different threads relating to modernity. So that's one point. And the second and last point has to do with your role and the book's role vis-a-vis travel and witnessing. So I think you know that, because at some point you address the reader, explicitly. The ethnographic detail you write that follows invites you, the reader, to share in the intimate experience of the pilgrim's journey. So I'm wondering, what is your role as, in a sense, a collector, a curator, participant, an archivist? You have so much knowledge, and I also, in my own ethnography, sometimes the ethnography was so comprehensive, there was no other databases about what it was that I was studying as my own. But then, because you really address the reader, is the reader a witness or a co-traveler, or it's an open question. So with this I end. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And okay. And, we end with Janet Klein.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. And Carel, your book is just, I think that holding this event today on the commemoration of the Armenian genocide, your book is so fitting, such a beautiful tribute to how, to that memory, to how people are commemorating the genocide and creating new memories as well. So it's always a risk going last when discussing, because of course the discussants before me gave such wonderful overviews of the book. But the beautiful thing about Carel's book is it's rich enough for there still to be more to be said about it. So I'm actually going to focus on something a little bit different, and that is focus a little more on historiography in the areas that I study, Kurdish Ottoman history. So until recently, Eastern Anatolia was seen as a backwater of the Ottoman Empire, whose dynamics were marginal to or an addendum to Ottoman history. In other words, scholars wrote as if the dynamics of Ottoman politics and society could really only be understood by studying the so-called core areas of the empire. In my own work, I've tried to show that understanding the so-called margins of empire is actually central to understanding Ottoman history at large. More recent works like another stunning hot off the press book by Nilay Uzok Gündoğan, The Kurdish Nobility in the Ottoman Empire, Loyalty, Autonomy, and Privilege, illustrates the centrality of Kurdish and Armenian actors in Ottoman governance and the making of the modern Ottoman state. These recent works also demonstrate the limitations of studying one group in the region in isolation. The most populous groups in Eastern Anatolia were Kurds and Armenians, but of course there were Turks, Assyrians, Arabs, and others. And yet for Kurds or Turks and Armenians, as well as for the interactions of other regional groups, until recently their histories have been presented as if, as actually Gerard Liberidian puts it, these peoples, quote, that coexisted for centuries did not interact except when they crossed each other's paths during massacres, each performing the predetermined and inescapable role their characters mandated. One, that of victim, the other, that of victimizer. And that's the end of his quote. In an attempt to rethink how these histories, which are quite intertwined on multiple levels, are narrated, the contributors to the volume, The Ottoman East in the 19th Century, edited by Jora Derderian and Sipahi, have attempted to write the history of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman East as an Ottoman history rather than a chapter of it. So we need to remember the ways in which Kurds and Armenians resisted centralizing activities of the state in the late Ottoman period together, the ways in which the minoritization of Kurds was closely linked to the process through which Armenians became minoritized as well. And we need to see how the choices made by Kurds at the end of the empire were framed by the Armenian genocide and the participation of some Kurds in it. So Carel's beautifully written book, while focusing on the pilgrimages of Armenians to Western Armenia in the geographic region, mainly of Eastern Anatolia, shows for students of Kurdish history that this thing called Kurdish history cannot be studied in isolation from the histories of Armenians and other regional groups. As different groups of pilgrims travel to visit the areas where their parents, great-grandparents, and other relatives survived the genocide or were lost in it, we see how these pilgrims encounter Armenians' Kurdish neighbors today, a number of whom they discover are actually descendants of Armenians who were orphaned or kidnapped during the genocide. As one pilgrim asked, were they relatives or were they descendants of perpetrators or both? The mixing up of these histories is most profoundly explored by Carel in chapter 21, towards the end of her moving book. And I recommend not just this chapter, but the whole book to students of Kurdish history for the ways in which it contributes to shaking up uncomplicated narratives of discrete groups perpetrated by the area studies approach. Armenian pilgrims to the region encounter a Kurdish movement that, unique in Turkey, was not only the first to recognize the genocide, but the role of the Kurds in it. Kurdish leaders have tried to reimagine a multi-ethnic Turkey by reintegrating an Armenian presence, if not yet in people, but in structures, such as Sırpgiragos, the Armenian church in Diyarbakir, which local Kurdish political leaders worked to restore, which I was able to see in 2011 myself. As Bertram notes, Abdullah Demirbaş, the mayor of Sur, Diyarbakir's historical center, quote, would soon make Kurdish the city's official language and add its once local languages like Armenian to its public signage. As the idea of Armenian language and people became more visible and less toxic, ethnic Kurds and Turks of partly or wholly Armenian parentage, but whose Armenian heritage had until then felt taboo, began to appear more frequently, end quote, especially inspired after the murder of Hrant Dink. Indeed, one Kurd we encounter in the book, an Armenian genocide survivor raised by a Kurdish family, came out of hiding, as Carel writes, and enlarged his identity to Armenian Kurdish without changing his religion. Thus, slowly as the living, breathing residents in this traumatized region are opting to embrace the complexities of their identities, so does Carel's book help us to recognize how multifaceted these identities in the past were as well, and to do a better job of teaching and narrating this region's history accordingly. Thank you again.
Thank you all for these amazing contributions. Yeah, it's, as you can imagine, it's a bit heavy thinking about, you know, all these communities, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Palestinians, many groups were mentioned. I don't know if we can open it in time-wise for an academic debate. We also had to fend off some Zoom bombers at the chat. But if folks have, which happened before, so I guess like this, in talks precisely about this issues about minorities. So I guess nationalism raises its head in various forms, unfortunately. But if folks have short comments or ideas, we would love to have them. I guess the Zoom conversation has ended, right?
No, it's still on.
It's
I
still
just
on.
disconnected the display for
Okay.
a second, so people should still be able to connect
So-
audio.
Okay, so yeah, so again, this is very moving. If you have short comments, we'd be happy to get them.
I have two, that fine?
Yeah.
Yeah, so firstly, thank you for this very beautiful. My first comment is about what your respondents asked, because you asked many things of the respondents. I'm curious what your respondents asked of you. And my second question is about what happened at the end of the. So you've taken us through the arc of their discovery and their enacting certain rituals and meeting and creating meetings. What happens then when they return to their non-homeland home?
Shall I answer these?
Yeah,
or-
just let's collect a few and then you
Okay,
answer.
and if we have time, but they're good questions.
And if there's nothing.
Sure, sure,
Sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you, Carel, for producing this fascinating book. Like you say, it's also archival, right? So many other research could be based on this, based on the findings and the kind of documents that you have, or maybe we can say like, this is counted accounts and stuff. Yeah, and I'm sure this is also very wonderful for like Armenian communities, to know that they're not alone in their searches, in their pilgrims, because I'm sure there are so many other pilgrims that you didn't contact them. One of them is myself, actually. I did that too with us on 2009. My question was a little bit similar to, that's what I was thinking. In your talk, you mentioned pilgrims as restorative agency. So do you know, or have you communicated with those people? Did they have any type of relief after, the pilgrim? What was restored, or was it restored? Do you have any this type of, kind of a reflection from their experience from those people?
Shall I answer?
Yeah.
First,
We would have taken more questions from Zoom, but since we have the Zoom bomber, I think we should
Yeah,
stick
we
with the
Could
audio.
get audio, but
Yeah,
that's it. So,
Yeah. so go ahead.
well, first, thank you, everybody, and thank you to my wonderful discussions who make me feel very good about the book, because of course it's a very personal thing to me. I lived it for so long, but it sounds to me like it came through to you and that you understood what I was saying and what I was especially feeling in this. To answer the questions about the aftermath of these, that's worth something. It is when the pilgrims, I'll answer yours first. In the book, I may even explain this, that many of the pilgrims feel the way some of us feel when we're going to give a presentation. We can't think of anything else except the presentation until it's given. And then, oh, hi, I'm so glad to see you. And on these pilgrimages, I witnessed this over and over again. Marianne, with her folder of things, could not do anything. She could talk to me. Do you think I'm actually going to see this? But after they had gone, there was this visible relief. They had experienced something that had changed them and had satisfied them. And when they got home, I don't know if there are long-term repercussions, but I do know that many of them then, I was invited to them, I watched them, had their families together and showed them their house and said, this is our house and you are a part of it. And that was a change. So that would be my answer to those. There's so much to look at. And like with yourself, each person that many people I've talked to said, well, I went or I have something to add. And I think, I wonder one, if I could, could add to the book, but I also wonder if what they experienced fits into some of the categories that I found.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something here. Well, in terms of whether, a pilgrim like this can create a sense of relief per person, I would say it can work both ways. And I have in mind, for instance, similar pilgrims that took place recently after 2004 in Cyprus. In Cyprus, in 2004, the so-called border between North Cyprus and Southern Cyprus opened. Many people who left as refugees to the south, they were allowed to visit their houses in the north. Well, and then there were, opinion polls conducted and surveys, and also some work similar to Carel's, took place. Some of them felt kind of relief, but some others, they came back even more angry and started, lobbying against, any rapprochement between the states and so on and so forth. I would say one thing that we have to bear in mind here is the generational gap here. For instance, in the case of Cyprus, we're talking about people from the first generation who have experienced, the event. Here we're talking about second, third, possibly fourth generation.
Third,
Yeah. So they are.
That's important.
Yeah. So it can work both ways. It depends.
Do you have something else?
No hands raised now.
Okay, so if not, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Chaim. Thank you, Carel. Thank you, Stefanos. Thank you, Alda. And mostly thank you, Carel, for your beautiful.
And the discount code, everybody knows.
And there's a discount code. Go and buy the book.
Oh, okay. Where do we get that discount?
At Stanford University Press.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'll print some of these up back in the office.
Yeah, you can also buy it with a discount through Nasser.
Oh, okay.
A good way.
Yeah, so that's.
They were doing is they were renaming themselves the co-hosts, trying to take over the meeting. So I kept declining. So like I was getting requests to take over the meeting. So I kept declining. We weren't allowed to audio or video.
Maybe something's on my Facebook page.
I don't know. All they were able to do was change their name. I think, like, she was doing a lot of getting these informations, like, they really weren't able to do anything, but if we hadn't had those things.
Okay. Sorry, Tom, I was bumping myself. Thank you. It's recorded?
Yeah.